Welcome to the Justice Journal podcast. I'm Sacramento County District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert. I hope you enjoy this podcast series where we discuss important public safety issues and provide insight into who we are as an office and what we do both in the courtroom and in the community to provide the highest level of public safety through prosecution, prevention, and innovation.
Thank you for joining us for this podcast episode. The last several episodes have focused on hate crimes. The first of this series examined the 1999 hate crime spree involving arson attacks on 3 Sacramento area synagogues and an abortion clinic, followed by a double murder in Shasta County. That was followed by our last episode, which featured an unsolved 2011 double murder of 2 Sikh men in Elk Grove. Today, we conclude this series by focusing on what is being done about hate crimes today. We have several guests joining us, so I can ask each of you to go ahead and introduce yourselves. Start with Anne Marie.
Anne Marie Schubert, District Attorney, Sacramento County.
I'm McGregor Scott, the United States Attorney for the Eastern District of California.
I'm Bob Tripp. I'm the Assistant Special Agent in Charge at the FBI Sacramento Field Office.
Deborah Gonzalez, President of the Board of Trustees of the Jewish Federation of the Sacramento Region.
I am Waseem Bawa, Chairman of the Board of Trustees for the SALAM Islamic Center here in Sacramento.
Thien Vu Ho. I am the Supervising Deputy District Attorney for the Sacramento Hate Crime and Gang Unit.
Great. Welcome, everyone.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So before we get started into the subject matter itself, can we talk a little bit first about the difference between a hate crime versus hate activity? Thien, I don't know if you want to start off with that one.
Sure. In California, Penal Code Section 422.55 defines what a hate crime is. A hate crime is essentially a criminal act committed because of a perceived characteristic that one of the victims have, such as race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, national origin. In California, it's a misdemeanor if you vandalize, if you threaten violence or commit violence upon another individual because of one of these characteristics. And that's punishable by up to a year in the county jail. It's a felony if there is an injury that occurs or the damage in terms of property being vandalized is in excess of $950, or the individual has a prior conviction for a hate crime. And that's a felony where you can go to prison. In California, we also have what is called a hate crime enhancement or allegation. So for example, if a defendant robs a gay couple because they're gay, not only does the defendant get charged with a robbery, but the hate crime enhancement adds up to an additional 3 years worth of sentence on top of the robbery sentence. The difference between a hate crime activity and a hate crime, and I'll give you an example, is let's say you have a white guy who is wearing a brown shirt with a Nazi armband and waving a Nazi flag. And that person decides to walk into Levi Stadium and goes to a 49er game. That's hateful, it's disgusting, but it's a hate activity. Versus that same man wearing the same brown shirt with the same armband, waving the same flag, walking into a synagogue on Yom Kippur and interrupting prayer service by saying hateful things. Because you cannot interfere with somebody's civil rights and civil liberties with practicing their religion. That's a hate crime. So essentially, that's the difference between the two.
Interesting. Anybody else want to add?
Well, from the federal perspective, we too have our hate crimes defined by a handful of statutes. There's the Church Arson Act. There's the act which makes it a crime to interfere with federally protected activities. And there's the, I think the most important statute that we have, the 2009 Matthew Shepard, James Byrd Hate Crimes Prevention Act. Those acts defined specific crimes which we can investigate as federal hate crimes. Just as the same on the state side, on the federal side, exercising one's free speech, no matter how odious that speech may be, is not a hate crime.
I think it might be helpful if maybe Deborah or Waseem kind of give examples that you might have seen that is a hate activity, just to let folks know and understand the challenges we face.
Sure. I know that, for example, last December, one of our synagogues was covered with flyers that were hateful speech, but no crime was committed. there were no damages. You tore down the flyers, and actually they had a video surveillance, so I think they maybe even identified who it was. But that's an example where we had to say, well, you know what's going on? Well, it's just hate speech.
Let's segue from that into talking about where are we today with hate crimes.
And in the Muslim community, just in the last couple of years, I can think of actually 3 examples. The Davis Mosque was vandalized, and I think the perpetrator was caught and eventually prosecuted and convicted, I believe. And then the Roseville Mosque, Tarbiyah, was vandalized. There was a lot of graffiti written on the outside of the doors and the walls. That person was never caught. And then there was another incident at the at another mosque in Sacramento. So that was just in the last couple of years.
Anybody else want to talk about that on a bigger picture?
Well, I just wanted to talk more from a global perspective, which is, I think people in our world understand, but perhaps not the public. Just because a crime is not reported does not mean it does not exist. And so, like for similar in the world of domestic violence, we all know that it doesn't get reported often, but that doesn't mean it doesn't occur. And so sometimes, and Thien, I'm sure, could talk about it from our side, is, we may not have a huge volume of cases we're prosecuting, but we all need to recognize that it still occurs. And we still have an obligation to our community to raise awareness, to educate people, to encourage them to report when it happens, and to really overcome the fears that folks might have. If people know me, I'm gay. If someone did something to me because I'm gay, I'd be the first person to call the cops and say, I think they did it because of this. But that's, I think, one of our challenges is just trying to raise awareness, make people understand and work with law enforcement, because sometimes folks don't want to work with law enforcement because they may feel they don't get, the treatment that they should get. But I don't believe that to be true. I just think that we need to educate our community to the best of our ability and do everything we can to make people understand we're going to do what we can within the bounds of the law.
And I just want to make the point to follow on to what Anne Marie just said, that we just spent a little bit of time talking about the distinction between hate speech and a hate crime. And my point would be to don't err on the side of not reporting it, right, and don't get wrapped around definitions on what's hate speech versus a hate crime. Let law enforcement and the prosecutors figure out which bucket it falls into. So if there is something out there, if there is, some event or somebody says something or there's a leafleting, whatever it may be, call the cops and let the cops figure it out.
Great. And the other part about that is, like for what happened with you guys with the leaflets, is you want to know about that person because this may be the precursor to them doing something else. Right. And so, it's like similar to what we see in domestic violence. You might start with one particular act that's, maybe it's a, threatening act or whatever, but it leads to something. At least it gets law enforcement the information they need.
That is an excellent point, because we can't start asking questions until people point us in the right direction. We need that input from the public.
Yeah, thanks for saying that, because as I think about the Muslim community, which, roughly, I would say 2/3 of whom are either immigrants or children of immigrants, they're unaccustomed to expressing and enforcing their rights simply because of the bias of where they came from. That's just, an expectation that we have to address. And so I think a lot of incidents, because they're accustomed to flying under the radar, don't want to make any waves, a lot of these incidents just simply don't get reported. And we have to educate our communities to, exercise that seldom exercised muscle of expressing your rights and speaking up. So I think that's a great point.
And if I could follow on to that just briefly, I think for our listeners, I think all of us in law enforcement and the prosecutor's offices would make the point that there is no issue, there is no topic which is more important to us than this one. And so, don't think that people aren't going to listen. Don't think the cops aren't going to take a report. Don't think the DA might not follow up, because we are. And by way of example, in late June, we had our annual United States Attorneys Conference in Washington, D.C., and the Attorney General, Bill Barr, came and spoke to us, and he told us emphatically that one of his top priorities is the enforcement of civil rights in this country. So it comes from the very top, certainly of the administration that I'm a part of, and I know it is for the DA's office as well.
Tim, do you want to expand on the challenges of the not maybe people who are not reporting? Talk a little bit about that.
Definitely. I think when it comes to the investigation of cases, the most difficult part for it is the lack or the underreporting. I think it was a great example that Anne Marie gave in regards to domestic violence. And the idea of underreporting, I'll just give a very personal example. I grew up in San Jose in the late 70s and early 80s. And I remember one day being in a Safeway parking lot with my uncle, changing a flat tire, and this white guy drove up in a big brown van, and he started cursing at us. He called us racial slurs, go back to Japan. I'm not from Japan. I was a refugee from Vietnam. And he started spitting at us, threatening us. And I wanted to go fight him, and my uncle held me back. And he didn't want to call the police, my uncle, because from where we come from, you don't trust law enforcement or the government. You don't want to stir the pot. You don't want to create problems. So it was never reported. And so one of the things that we have to do is to educate, to be vigilant, and to have community outreach. Because otherwise, these matters are going to go unreported. And like you said, the police can't investigate it unless it's reported. So let us find out, and as McGregor Scott said, so we can figure out what bucket it falls into, so we can investigate and go after it. But that's the biggest hurdle with investigating the case.
And also, go ahead.
I was just going to offer one glimmer of sunshine in this discussion. The fact that we're all concerned about this, I think, is a reflection that we all recognize the importance of community outreach and relationships between community groups and law enforcement. And I think we're seeing an improvement in the statistics that we're collecting. The FBI spends a lot of time and resources trying to chart the ebb and flow of hate crimes. And we're in fact seeing our numbers go up, which I think reflects as much greater reporting than an increase in the actual instances of hate crime. So I think things are trending in the right direction.
When a hate crime does occur, can we talk about the impact on not just the victims, but that community in general? What ripple effects would that have?
Well, let me start with just one of the last episodes that we did on the podcast was that had to do with the double homicide in Elk Grove of the two Sikh gentlemen. And I mean, that's been years and years, and that is almost like it happened yesterday. It's just the impact on the entire Sikh community, because I think most people just, there's no other explanation than a hate crime. And so it has resonated with that community, not just in Elk Grove, but really across the region, about how much those crimes live with them, and particularly when they remain unsolved.
So I'll just share sort of a very recent and personal experience. Muslims recently celebrated the Eid al-Adha, which is the celebration of, if you're not familiar with it, it's the story around Abraham about to sacrifice his son, and so every year Muslims celebrate this event, and we have a prayer in the morning. So that happened a couple of weeks ago, and because of capacity constraints at SALAM, we're right across from American River College. So we decided to hold our prayer early in the morning, around 8 o'clock in the morning, on the football field at ARC. And there was a ton of planning around security, because we had just come off of a few days earlier the mass shootings in El Paso and in Ohio, and several months before that the shootings in New Zealand. And we're super concerned about another event like that happening when we've advertised very publicly about having this event happening, and there's going to be over 1,000 people show up. And so when we're planning for security measures, we're thinking about points of ingress and egress. We're thinking about how a vehicle might be able to ram through. There's a parking structure that's 6 stories high that overlooks the football field, and we're thinking about an elevated position if somebody has line of sight. And so we're positioning people, monitoring if there's anybody that's going to enter the parking garage. We did a sweep of the parking garage. I mean, those are the things that we have to do now because we're so concerned about assuring the safety of our congregants. So that's just one very recent example that happened a couple of weeks ago.
You had also mentioned prior to the podcast about security measures now at houses of worship. Can you talk about how that's changed?
Well, it's just an increase. So from the Jewish community, sometimes I hate to go back to the Holocaust, but you talk about the ultimate hate crime, right? And we still have generations alive who lived through it. So it's still a constant reminder. If you go back to your first podcast and the fire bombings, I'd say in Sacramento, that's when things probably stepped up more here in terms of security. That's where more of the congregations and the other facilities, the day school, and anybody who has a building started to increase the hardscape. And that was a hard transition. You had congregants, why are you putting a fence and a gate around my house of worship, right? It sort of goes contrary to the idea that you're a house of worship and you want to open your doors to everybody. But first we have to check your ID, or, no one in Sacramento yet has metal detectors, but there are metal detectors at any synagogue in Europe, that you're going through. You have to make an appointment if you're a tourist and you want to worship, anywhere in Europe. But getting back to locally, I'd say with every incident that occurs, it gets easier, I guess, to ask people for money for security. But that's the other challenge, besides the human challenge, which is I can't believe that we have to hire a security guard, and the feeling of being threatened. I mean, obviously in the last 12 months, you had Pittsburgh and you had Poway. I mean, that's really personal. But there's actually the cost. And there have been grants available for hardscape. And I think almost every organization has applied for grants and received some funding. But no grants cover human beings. And it's really the security guards that we're needing. And then there's even debates, do we want an armed security guard or an unarmed one? And when do we call the sheriff or the PD to just park a car in front and that sort of thing? So in addition to the emotional cost and the cultural cost, there's the actual financial cost that it has.
Is there fear then among the communities when one of these events occur?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you are eyeballing people within your sanctuary. If you don't recognize them, you're going to go up and greet them, of course, which you would do for anyone. But if they're wearing a backpack or there's something, just something's not right, it's challenging.
Yeah, I'm constantly receiving, comments of concern or suggestions of how to further harden our facility. But it's been ever present, right? The constant concern. As chairman of the board, I get a lot of these requests and suggestions coming to me. So I've definitely seen an uptick of that in the last year or two.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about what we're doing then about the hate crimes. And I'm going to bring up the hate crimes task force. So whoever wants to start talking about that.
Sure. I think in the time shortly after the fire bombings of the synagogues in Sacramento and the murders of Gary Mattson, Winfield Matter, in Shasta County, my predecessor, Paul Sieve, in the United States Attorney's Office, helped to create what we call the Hate Crimes Task Force. And it remains in existence to this day. We meet irregularly, I would say quarterly or semi-annually, and it brings together a great collection of different organizations, different communities in the broader community who, so the Muslim community is extremely well represented, the Jewish community, the Sikh community, all these various different ethnic groups, religious groups, and it's a forum really for people to talk about concerns and issues and problems. And by way of example, right after the Pittsburgh shooting, we, in conjunction with the FBI, held sort of an active shooter training for representatives from houses of worship. Things to do or not do, and how to protect yourself better. These kinds of things. We also, Anne Marie, you will remember, we had you come over and speak about officer-involved shootings in the months after the Clark episode here in Sacramento, and so it really creates, I think, a very positive forum for disparate people to come together in a united way to address concerns, try to answer questions, these kinds of things.
So a way to understand what's going on from different perspectives and what can be done about it. Can you, Deborah?
I really appreciate having the task force. We have invited the task force to Jewish Federation to meet with our leaders from our various constituents, whether it's to talk about updates or getting the word out about how important it is to report anything. We have an annual security update. We invite someone from the Anti-Defamation League to come, but also somebody local, again, right before our high holidays, which are coming up end of September, to sort of, again, give an update as to security, what's been the best measures, anything new going on. We know that if there's somebody suspicious that the FBI is targeting, they'll send us an email and, and kind of fill us in. And then that quarterly update that you guys held, whenever it was, and sometime in the spring, was also very informative. All the different law enforcement agencies gave an update about what's happening, what they're doing, and then there was an open sort of a Q&A that everybody in that audience could problem solve, basically, what's going on.
Can you talk about how other ways you work with law enforcement in terms of the faith community?
Well, I've got him on my speed dial. I mean, honestly, after Bawa's shooting that afternoon, I was on the phone with one of them. I couldn't get a hold. Sean, I couldn't get a hold of because he was moving or something. But so McGregor, and we got reassurance that law enforcement has our back, and that I think is the big. And then we could publicize that to our community.
So pretty open communication then with our local law enforcement.
Yeah, I'd echo Deborah's comments as well. I think the Muslim community and SALAM in particular has had very positive experiences engaging with law enforcement, with SAC PD, with Sheriff's Department, with the US Attorney's Office. I mean, very responsive. The Eid celebration and the prayers that I referred to earlier, unprompted. We had additional patrols coming through and just kind of checking up on us. We frequently have visits from the Sheriff's Department and SAC PD at our facility, inquiring and just checking in on us and just asking if there's anything they could do. So it's been a wonderful relationship, and I'm just very, very pleased and thankful for that.
The other thing, if I could just mention, because I remember what month it was that you held the conference that I came to, whatever, maybe 6 months ago. And I think the thing the Hate Crimes Task Force is valuable for raising awareness, educating folks. But I think really one of the greatest things is the coming together of diverse groups of folks. And that's the thing that I love about Sacramento, is that we're probably the most diverse community you'll find in this country. And what I've learned in the last 5 years going out to the community is it doesn't matter what your walk of life is, your economic situation, your religion, whatever it is, everybody wants the same thing. We all want to raise our families in a safe environment. That's it. It comes down to feeling safe. And by bringing together diverse groups to really, for the purpose of hate crimes, but really to me, it's a far greater wonderful thing that kind of comes out of it, is that we all get to meet each other, recognize our interests, but also share that we all have the common thing, which is we want to have a safe community, and no matter what it is. So that's what I think is wonderful about the Hate Crimes Task Force, in addition to the main purpose.
I couldn't agree more. And really, frankly, some of the practical things that come out of this are just the flow of information. And so 2 examples. Number one, we had the FBI Special Agent in Charge and I met with the Jewish Federation shortly after the Pittsburgh shooting. And one of the ideas that came out of that was, well, can't local law enforcement, if something like this happens, can't the Sheriff's Department or the Police Department just park a patrol car in front of the synagogues or the mosques or whatever it may be for a little while, just as a sign of deterrence? So I thought to myself, well, that's a great idea. So we've now instituted a practice here in this county where that happens.
Every time there's
And so the morning of the Christchurch shooting, I was on the phone, and I was absolutely assured that they were out in front of the mosques and doing those things. So really good. And then the second piece of that that's come out of this is that just the exchanging of information, because I think for these communities who can be the targets of these things, they just want to know, do we have to worry? And so by way of example, the morning of the I can never, is it Poway or Poway shooting, I was on the phone with the United States Attorney in San Diego, who assured me this appears to be a lone wolf, sole actor, doesn't appear to be any part of grand master plan here. So I then called the executive director of the Jewish Federation to pass that along. So these folks, and he said, "Can I tell my board members that?" And I said, "Absolutely," because we want to give some comfort to the folks in our community who are part of this broader community that's been targeted. And so just the information flow alone, I think, has just really been terrific.
Yeah, I got to say, Greg, I was so impressed, not just with the information flow, but the speed of that information flow and the reaction time. Because the Christchurch shooting happened mostly when most Sacramentos had already gone to bed.
Yes.
And they only found out about it the next morning. And you and I were at a press conference at SALAM, like I think at noon. That's it. That very same day.
That morning, so my wife would be the first one to tell you that I go to bed really early, but I also get up really early. And I got up that morning to the news, and my immediate thought was, let's get the patrol cars out, and we're going to SALAM for services today. That's what we're doing.
Yeah.
And we did, and it just is, just to send a message, and so. I couldn't be more pleased. And it really does come back to the Hate Crimes Task Force, because that's been the vehicle around which we've established these relationships and continue to exercise them.
Yeah, it's like the glue that sort of brings and holds everybody together. That's great.
Could I point out just one additional benefit of the task force? The task force has been great at building relationships between community and law enforcement, but it's also, from my own personal perspective, been great at developing relationships among different law enforcement groups. Sitting at the table here, we have two completely different jurisdictions. In many places, that kind of a difference leads to conflict. But here in Sacramento and California generally, it's a very collaborative atmosphere. And that is one of the great benefits of the task force.
That's an interesting point. So let's talk about the law enforcement side when there's a case. However you can, talk about the investigation and the prosecution. So Thien for Sacramento County, and I don't know if you can talk about the investigation of some of these cases.
I can't talk about any non-adjudicated case, but I can give you a little idea of our general approach to it. We depend upon the public, our community contacts, and our sources in the community to let us know where there's a problem. When we get a call, we'll generally respond immediately. We'll send a team of agents out to talk to people who have information about what's happened. We'll bring that information back. The FBI's got access to a number of different databases. We can look at ongoing investigations, and we can really assess the facts that we get. And based upon that assessment, we'll move forward accordingly. One of the things that we do as standard practice is to reach out to the jurisdiction where the incident took place. We want to make sure that we're not duplicating efforts. We also want to bring our partners in. The FBI is great at doing certain things with a national scope, but the Sacramento Sheriff's Office, the Sacramento Police Department have their own strengths. And when we can utilize that synergy, it's a great thing. We can really make some progress.
How does that work then? If someone were to call into the Sacramento Police Department or Sheriff's Department, does that dictate which jurisdiction does the investigation, or how does that work?
It's very collaborative. Usually the first person who gets the call will be the first person on the scene, but we've worked to develop these relationships so we know to call our partners and our partners know to call us. Okay. So we'll show up, we'll all bring our own expertise to bear, and we'll let the prosecutors fight about where it's best prosecuted.
And then on the federal prosecution side of it, we have dedicated assistant U.S. attorneys both in our Sacramento office and our Fresno office who focus on civil rights prosecutions. So the FBI team that does this, they know who to call because there's a trained, committed person on our side of it who will look at it from the federal perspective. And you have to remember, to go back to some of the things that Bob said at the outset, we have limited jurisdiction. The DA has general jurisdiction. So there has to be some triggering event that gives the feds jurisdiction. And a great example that I sat in on a full briefing on the San Bernardino shooting here a few years ago now with the number 2 guy in the US Attorney's Office and then the guy that was the head of the FBI in LA at the time. And early on, they really didn't know what the motive was because all of that really came out later. But somebody found a bomb inside of the building, and that's what allowed the feds to have some jurisdiction to come in to investigate. So I just want to be cautious in saying that people should not assume automatically that we have jurisdiction because there has to be some, one of these protected federal civil rights, bomb-making materials. There has to be something that allows the FBI to investigate and the U.S. attorneys to prosecute, because it's really the local law enforcement agencies and the DA's office who have more general criminal jurisdiction than we do.
So Tim, I'm going to ask you then if you can talk about what we're doing here in Sacramento County on hate crimes in terms of prosecution.
Definitely. So for the Sacramento DA's office, we have the gang hate crime unit. I'm the supervisor of that unit, including myself. We have 6 attorneys assigned to prosecute all the hate crimes that occur in Sacramento County. And we also have 2 very seasoned and veteran investigators assigned to the case as well. I can tell you that from a statistics standpoint, since 2015, we've prosecuted 19 hate crime cases. Now, obviously, there are more incidents than that, but that's how many that we have filed and we have prosecuted in that period of time. In terms of the process, what will happen is, let's say there is some sort of crime that occurs in the community. The sheriff's department is called out. The patrol officer will get there. They'll interview the victim. If there is any allegation or possibility of a hate crime, they will then contact their detective. Their detective will conduct follow-up investigation, and that information will be forwarded to my office to be reviewed. If for some reason a detective is not initially called, and it's just a patrol officer taking that statement, but we suspect that it's a hate crime case because it comes through our intake division or it comes into our office and is filed, but there's no hate crime that occurs to it, and an attorney in the office notices that, they will then forward the report to me. I will read it, review it. I'll request follow-up investigation to make a determination about whether or not a hate crime did or did not occur. I can give you 2 examples. One is a case that was rejected for a hate crime, and one that was filed and we have fully litigated all the way through. So there was a case in which 2 neighbors lived next to each other for years. One was Hispanic, the other was a white gentleman, Caucasian. Never had any problems at all. But in the last 3 months, the Caucasian neighbor started yelling racial slurs at the Hispanic neighbor and just started threatening to report him to ICE, deportation, a number of different things, and just a series of racial slurs. We received the case to decide whether or not to file a hate crime allegation. Now, mind you, they've lived together next to each other for years without any problems. I requested follow-up investigation, and part of that determined that the individual that was lobbying these racial slurs had recently had a change in his medication. He had a psychological condition. His father had passed away, and there were a series of stressors. So the motivating factor was not one that was hate crime related. Now, I'll compare that to another case, and it's People versus Daniel Stoddard. And that case is now completely resolved and done with. It was in December of 2017. Mr. Stoddard was at the Republic Bar over on 15th Street. And on that evening, people were drinking. At one point, there's the victim side. There was the victim who was out at the bar with his wife. They were there with a gay couple. At one point, Mr. Stoddard somehow assumed that somebody on the victim's side, one of the members of the gay couple, was hitting on him. And he got angry and he started yelling homophobic slurs. He was eventually escorted out of the bar. But before he was escorted out of the bar, the victim side decided to leave. They walked out. The defendant then followed them, walked up, yelled homophobic slurs. "I'm going to kick your gay ass," is one of the things he said, along with a series of other very profane comments. And he went over and he didn't attack necessarily somebody in the gay couple, but he attacked the man that was married. And because he thought he was gay. And he essentially broke the man's face, his orbital socket, his jaw, to the point where the victim had to have reconstructive surgery. So we prosecuted the defendant for the assault causing great bodily injury, along with the hate crime as well. And he received a sentence of 6 years in state prison as a result of that. And he had no record before that, but it was clearly a hate crime. And so that is an example of what we have done here. And that case ended up resolving earlier this year.
Let's talk about looking forward then on hate crimes. Unfortunately, I don't know if this is an issue or problem that's going to go away, especially anytime soon. Does anybody have any thoughts or insight into what we can or should be doing about hate crimes in the future or now?
I think the most important thing is what we've talked about, which is you constantly have to educate folks and raise awareness and build relationships. And so people know that they can call McGregor or they can call the FBI, they call our office because, that's the only way we know it happens. And if we don't educate folks and we don't vigorously prosecute people when we can prove it, then we haven't accomplished our mission, right? And so I think the education is the most critical part, along with building healthy relationships with our community.
Anybody else?
I would say one of the most interesting things to me as being U.S. Attorney is we do a lot of outreach to the various religious communities, and I've commented on this before, but in the last year or so, I spent a lot of time at Islamic houses of worship up and down the district, and I never cease to be amazed at learning things and the commonalities of the three monotheistic religions in the Western culture. It's amazing to me how many things we share. And I was at the Folsom Islamic Center for an open house that they had, and there was a chart up on the wall with a list of all the prophets in the Quran. And I went, wait a minute, that's my list of prophets, right? Because it was so remarkably similar to the Bible. Obviously, the one exception being that Jesus is a prophet as opposed to the Messiah, and then Muhammad is the culminating prophet for the Islamic religion. And then I also learned that there's a chapter in the Quran about Mary, the mother of Jesus, and the Immaculate Conception. The point of all this is to say that there's more that binds us than separates us. And the more we can extend a hand of friendship to those who practice different religions than we do, and the more we can learn about those things that we have in common, all of this is going to go much better.
It sounds like Sacramento is doing a great job in terms of working together, open communication, as you talked about, the task force, and informing and doing the outreach. So, I feel like we're pretty far ahead of maybe some other communities.
Yeah.
Do you have any?
And I really appreciate, Greg, what you just said. And, I think that's absolutely true. And I wonder if, more people understood things like that we wouldn't have as many hate crimes and hate activity. Because, when I think about addressing hate crimes, I also think about what is the underlying driver for hate in the first place. And I think it comes from a fundamental lack of understanding of what our country is all about. And, we were talking earlier about, the fear of reporting from particularly the immigrant Muslim community and other immigrant communities. And then where the genesis of hate activity and hate crimes, I think it's two sides of the same coin. And what I mean by that is it's because it comes from a lack of understanding that America and the nation we live in is an idea, and it's not a defined group of people that look a certain way. It's not a place. And when I think about what the Constitution guarantees, that all men are created equal, it's not, the founders didn't say all white men are created equal or certain religions are preferred. The guarantee for freedom of religion is enshrined in the Constitution. And so I try to do my part with educating our community about feeling a sense of belonging, that you are fully American. If you're brown, you're American. If you're Muslim, you're American. If you're gay, straight, you're American. All of those things make you equally American. And the guy that's out there spewing hateful things because he has an idea of what America should look like, and we're all who don't fit that mold shouldn't be here. I think it requires education on, about what is the sense of what does it mean to be an American and what it means to belong, and it's a place for all of us, right?
And to exercise their rights.
Yeah.
Which they do.
I just, following up with what Anne Marie said, reaching out, especially to the immigrant communities, I'm kind of curious if there's, as part of a task force or as part of each organization, what attempts are made. I work in healthcare, and I know I have had to learn about the Hmong traditions and the Mien traditions and all of that, because I need to know who in the family, one is the caregiver, but one is the decision maker, right? So we healthcare providers try to do our best to understand the other cultures that we're interacting with so we can have the best outcome for the individual who needs our help. Are there programs and activities where you're doing that, teaching your employees, right, teaching law enforcement? Sometimes they're generalizations, but kind of who's the go-to person in each community, and then addressing them at a really young age.
Well, two things. One, from an internal point of view and outside. But a couple of years ago, our office decided to start a program called Know Your Rights. And so we go out to the community, really primarily through Highlands Charter School, and we just educate folks on what their rights are as citizens. It may be their housing rights, there may be their civil rights, it might be their constitutional rights. And I think it's been an incredibly powerful program because, again, there's a lot of fear. And, people don't know what their rights are if they're a victim of a crime, but they're undocumented, with the rights they have with the U visas or T visas or whatever those are. So that helps, again, with that whole increase in reporting and all that stuff. How do we know our community? I know my community partly because I have to go out and I learn and meet people and all that kind of stuff. I mean, we do internal training and things like that as well.
And I think our office here, first of all, those are very eloquent words that you said that speaks to the heart of what the vision of America is. I think sometimes we forget that. And we should never forget it because it's a beautiful vision. It is the Camelot, right, of the world, and we should never forget that. But when it comes down to it, racism, hate, all of that comes from ignorance, and we have to educate. And I think you're talking about what we call cultural competence, right? Coming out there and being a part of the community and understanding that community. And I know that our office really strives with our community prosecution bureau to do those very things and to get out into the community. And one of the things, I know I gave my card to both of you, I like to go out and speak to the Jewish Federation, to homes, to places of worship for Islam and for different other places, because we need to reach out, and we do reach out, but there's always more to do. Because at some point we have to say enough is enough. And I think we are at that point in our community to do that. And there is a great motivation and force behind it. And this podcast is a beautiful example of that. And the task force is a beautiful example of that.
That's a great point. The primary mission of the FBI is to conduct successful investigations. But I think our civil rights program has recognized that if we get a call, in some ways we've failed. We failed to prevent a hate crime. And that's why outreach, training, community relationships are so important. And I think that's common among all the people here at the table today.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, and I'll say that there's probably more that minority groups like the Muslim community can do to kind of go out into communities that, we're unfamiliar with, right? And sort of tell our story. I can tell you sort of, I'm a brown Muslim immigrant. Those three characteristics may, push the rage buttons of certain extremists in this country, right? But at the same time, I'm a veteran and, spent 5 years with the 82nd Airborne Division. And that was an extremely formative experience for me as a young man because I learned very quickly that not only am I fully and equally an American, being in the military really very quickly grounds you in the fact that you're part of this very diverse group of folks who will basically defend one another with their lives, regardless of skin color or religion and any of those characteristics. So that's a story that I'm not the only one with a story like that. There's so many of us, and we just have to go out and let people know, what we're all about and where we come from, and we're just like everybody else. So, and I think that'll help reduce the sort of the rage temperature in certain communities, right?
I want to bring up reaching youth and trying to start early with informing them about rights, but also trying to introduce them to different cultures and different faiths. I know, Anne Marie, you're a big believer in starting young.
Well, we have to do that,
Yeah.
right? But one of the things we do, we've done for many years now, is we have a youth academy that's about a 10-week program or so. Invite kids from all over. It's to learn primarily about the criminal justice system, but it's not just the DA's office. It's law enforcement, it's the public defender's office, it's the courts, and because we want people to understand it. But the beauty of that program, particularly in the last couple of years, is that most often it's 90% kids of color. And that's what we want, because we want our system to reflect our community, right? And so I think, and we bring in diverse speakers and all that kind of stuff. It's not specifically on hate crimes. We do have a topic on that, but I think it's valuable because it's just another mechanism to build relationships, and you're starting now at a high school age. And so I think it's a really good opportunity for us to educate our youth.
The FBI actually has a similar program where we have a teen academy, and twice a year we bring in groups from local high schools to learn about the federal justice system, to learn about the criminal justice system. And it's a great way of setting another example for people that you don't just have to be bound by your community, but there's a bigger world out there.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And I would also like to give a shout out to the US Attorney's Office that's got also a very aggressive outreach program where they actually go to local high schools, and the FBI has been honored to partner up with them in those visits.
Yeah.
The folks in my office are heavily involved in Operation Protect and Defend and other civics types of organizations that go into the high schools and really try to ground people very much in the things, Waseem, that you so eloquently described. And you know, these are your rights and those kinds of things. So we do try to go out and really, it's the children of immigrants much of the time that are in those classrooms, because it's the public high schools here in Sacramento. And so we're trying to do our bit to make sure those people do understand there's a structure, and there's a constitution, and there's a system, and there are rights, and they can call the police if there's a problem, and someone will respond, and there will be action. And I would say my middle son is a graduate of that FBI Teen Academy and still talks about it to this day. It's such a great experience.
Well, for more information on the DA's Youth Academy, you can go to our website at sacda.org. And then does the FBI Sacramento have information?
We do. We have information on our internet site.
Okay. Well, I think we've covered just about everything. So thank you, everybody. I think this is a really interesting, thoughtful conversation.
Very much.
So, yeah, thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Can I
You
say
get the most
one last
eloquent
thing?
storyteller.
Oh, I don't know.
So this is really a broader issue than this particular topic that we're discussing today. But what Waseem said about his service in the military and other things really brought to mind. We've talked a lot today about your rights, but we also need to remember we all have responsibilities as Americans, and it's not just about these are my rights. It's you also have responsibilities. And that part of that responsibility is to be a law-abiding member of society and wanting to help other people in our community and serve our nation in the military and do these different things. So I just wanted to say that, because sometimes I think we talk about rights all the time and we never talk about responsibilities. So
Great point.
Very fair.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. You can find all of the Justice Journal podcasts on our website at sacda.org, iTunes, Google Play, and YouTube.